Okay, here we go again. Don't you love summer? I love summer. Summer's so great. Why can't it last forever? So I want to today then pick up on where I left off in the last video, where we were sort of talking about history and theory, technique of IQ testing. So you remember when I left off, or I guess I left off, but in the last video, made reference to the fact that Galton had first person sort of try to do this, wasn't very effective, and then Alfred Binet in France came up with an effective IQ test. Now, it was effective in the sense that it produced outcomes that were highly predictive. So if you did well on the IQ test, good outcomes like scholastic achievement would result. So in that sense, it was valuable. That's why we would say it worked. But Spearman, remember old Charles Spearman, so Spearman's problem, though, was that it wasn't adequately theorized. Binet wasn't interested in understanding the theoretical underpinnings of why a particular test worked. And the problem with that, of course, is that it would be hard to replicate in terms of making new kinds of studies. I mean, you could see in the long run whether the new studies if the new test actually worked or not, but you'd have to wait to see the outcomes, right? Whereas if you had a theoretical foundation, then you'd have a guidance as to what kinds of tests you could use to get more effective outcomes from IQ tests. So Spearman was very concerned with conceptualizing and providing theoretical foundations for how all this worked, as opposed to Binet, not so much concerned. So this all leads into G factor and factor analysis, which I know I still have an outstanding promise to do factor analysis video, which I will do. So we'll just allude to it briefly here and there. But it was through the use of factor analysis he was able to identify what kinds of tests were highly G-loaded. That is, what kind of tests provided a really good test for whether a particular, a good assessment, a good way of judging whether or not a particular test of IQ was going to provide reliable insights into the level of G of the person taking the test, right? The degree of general intelligence that that person possessed. So I just got a little list here I'm reading from. So among the things that are highly G-loaded, the kind of tests that will reliably tell you whether a person has, G, general intelligence. Remember, the whole G factor thing is that if you have a high G, you'll generally do well at all the different kinds of tests. But the idea of what Spearman was going for here was that without requiring someone to do all the different kinds of tests, the different silos or bundles of different kinds of testing different kinds of abilities, you come up with a small number of tests that you already knew were highly G-loaded, right? So these kinds of tests were things like matrix relations, which is something I'll talk about more in this video, generalizations, series completions, which is usually connected with matrix relations, verbal analogies, paragraph comprehension, perceptual analogies. The part of the problem, though, is that in a lot of these cases we don't actually know precisely how Spearman meant for these things to be tested. So the content is often missing, though you can draw certain kind of inferences from his description of what we're talking about. As I say, in the case of the matrix relations, we know quite well. I'll get to that. And that's the highest, right? That's got like a 0.94 correlation. It's by far the most highly correlated we've been able to identify G in those taking the tests. On the other hand, low G loading is for tests like maze speed, getting through mazes, the speed at which you get through a maze, counting dots, simple addition, tapping speed, and recognition memory. These things all have quite low G factor. So he was able to make these kinds of distinctions. In addition, in getting more at the sort of theoretical underpinning, Spearman identified three, what he called I'm not sure about pronunciation, of course, genetic laws. And noegenesis simply refers to the production of new knowledge. So laws about the production of new knowledge. So if you could understand this, how people produce knowledge, then you'd be in a better position to be able to evaluate how they're implementing these abilities within the context of an IQ test, right? So he's got these three laws. So we'll just briefly mention them, and you'll see, as I describe them, you'll see how they come into play when we turn to talking about the matrix test. So number one is the apprehension of experience. So this is the awareness of oneself directly experiencing the focus of attention. Right, so that's sort of, you know, a broad overview, sort of a broad overview capacity, I suppose. The next two, though, are the ones that I think you see more directly put into operation when we discuss the matrix, the matrix test. So number two then is the adduction of relations. So this is recognizing the relation between two or more characters, right? So the character is just whatever the thing, the substance of that's being provided for you to calculate, or calculate is not the right word, but to cogitate upon to arrive at the right answer that's going to evaluate your IQ, right? So an example of this would be if I gave you the example of branch and trunk, what would be an associated term, right? What would be the common relationship that these two have? And a logical answer obviously would be tree, right? Because they're both parts of a tree. Neogenetic law number three is the adduction of correlates. So here you're presenting a character with a relation added to the character, and you're looking for what other character is evoked for the person being tested by the combination of the character and the relationship. So an example of this would be if I were to say to you high as a character and opposite as a relation, then the answer you'd probably come up with would be low, right? Because the opposite of high would be low, right? So these are the three laws of the ways in which people produce knowledge, and if you understand this, then you can create tests which get specifically at the capacity, at the level of intelligence, of general intelligence, to be able to produce these kinds of outcomes from the tests that you're being exposed to. So, as I say, arguably from a purely practical point of view, arguably the most important contribution of Spearman was the development of these nonverbal tests, which came to be called the matrices. So the idea here was to use non-verbal shapes which got over any challenge around sort of cultural bias, and I'll talk about the whole issue of cultural bias in a future video, got around that by using these geometric shapes which were basically familiar to everyone. I mean, anyone over 3 years old in any culture would be familiar with these kinds of shapes. And they were organized then into a 3x3 matrix. So like 9 units, right? And you would have a pattern on the first 8, and then the last one, the sort of bottom right-hand corner, would be left blank. And the challenge to the tester would be then to fill in the correct answer from a set that was offered, usually 6 or sometimes 8 different alternatives were offered, and one would have to choose from that bottom set as to which was the correct one to put in that bottom right-hand corner to finish off a pattern that had been established through the prior 8 boxes of the matrix. So this was Spearman's maybe most lasting at a sort of a technical level of IQ testing. This is probably his most lasting contribution. The use of the matrix relations has been refined over the years by others, including his Spearman's own student John Raven. And in fact, the tests that are now used today, and that I'm using as examples in this video, are drawn. They're drawn from what is now called Raven's progressive matrices. And they're called progressive. They're Ravens because John Raven, Spearman's student, but though he wasn't the only one, other people since have contributed to refining these tests. And progressive because as you go through the IQ test, the matrices get more challenging, and I'm showing you here in the video examples of tests that get increasingly difficult as you go on. So it turns out then that these progressive matrices are the highest G-loaded tests that are available. And I mentioned that there's incredibly high G loading, as high as 0.94, which is 1 is the highest, right? So, extremely high correlations. So again, they would these ultimately these tests, these matrix tests, had to be stood up against the way the original identification of G through the ability to do well at all these different kinds of tests. And what you find is a correlation. The people who do well at all the tests, i.e. have a high G, also score a high score on these matrices tests. So it's just kind of a shortcut for getting a G. Even though G is characterized by your ability to do well a whole lot of different things, this one set of tests becomes a kind of shortcut by which you can determine a level of an individual's G. Hope that's clear. And this is also, it's also become the use of the matrix tests, the matrix relations tests, have now created the opportunity to have a quick shorthand to be able to assess the G-loadedness of other kinds of tests. So what they do then is they take the results from the matrix relations test and the X test, the other one that we're trying to determine how effective it is at measuring G, right? We take them, put them together, and put them through a factor analysis. Ah, yes, factor analysis is still coming. Okay, you put them through a factor analysis, and the results tell you then the effectiveness of the X, right? The X test in determining G, right? Because if the results of that factor analysis shows a high G factor rating, then you know that the X test didn't drag down the results from the matrix test. Whereas if you get results that are lower than you would expect from the matrix test, then you know that the other test, the X test, is not a heavily G-loaded test because it's drawing down it's dragging down the results, which you would have expected if you were just doing the matrix test. So this development of matrix test, if you do modern day IQ tests, you'll see plenty of that sort of thing on it. It's immensely important today, but it's also, by understanding the history of it, we get some sense of not only how it developed, but how it gave increasing insight into our ability to be able to measure G, to measure general intelligence. So that's a short little one that sort of expands on the history and technique. I know I'm sort of picking up the speed. I'm picking up the speed, the intellectual challenge of the density of the ideas. If this is beginning to go too fast, let me know, and I will slow down. But I think that's a good number 2. So coming up next, I don't know, maybe we'll get the G factor, but still a couple other things that we have to look at. All right. That's it.